The Joseph Smith Sr. family moved to this 100-acre property in western New York around 1818. Joseph Smith Jr. labored with his father and brothers to remove trees and prepare the heavily forested land for farming. On the morning of a beautiful, clear day, early in the spring of 1820, young Joseph went into these woods to pray, to a place where he had previously designed to go. Here, God the Father and his resurrected Son, Jesus Christ, appeared to Joseph Smith to commence the restoration of the gospel in the latter days. Of the experience, Joseph Smith said, "I was enwrapped in a heavenly vision and saw two glorious personages who exactly resembled each other in features and likeness, surrounded with a brilliant light which eclipsed the sun at noonday. They told me that the fullness of the gospel should at some future time be made known unto me." Joseph Smith's family moved away from this farm in 1830. The church acquired the land in the early 1900s. The exact location of Joseph Smith's first vision is unknown, but it occurred somewhere within a 10-acre forest on the western boundaries of the farm. This forest has been referred to as the Sacred Grove since 1906. The Joseph Smith Sr. family built and moved into a log house in the woods several miles south of the village of Palmyra, New York, around 1818. On this farm, young Joseph and his brothers and sisters learned to work hard, love each other, and do as they were commanded of God. The Smith family read together from the Bible and always had family prayers in this home. 14-year-old Joseph was living here at the time of his first vision in the spring of 1820. 3.5 years later, in the upstairs bedroom where he and his brothers slept, Joseph prayed to know his standing before God. The angel Moroni appeared and taught the young prophet about a restoration of divine truth and authority in which he would participate. Most of the family moved into a new frame home on the farm in 1825. 5 years later, they all moved away from Manchester. When the church purchased this property in 1930, the log home was no longer standing. A replica was rebuilt on the original site and dedicated by President Gordon B. Hinckley in 1998. Alvin Smith, Joseph's older brother, started construction on the frame house on the Smith farm in 1822. After Alvin's death in 1823, the family completed it and moved in 1825. Joseph brought his new wife Emma to live here in January 1827. 8 months later, he and Emma drove a carriage to the Hill Cumorah, where Joseph received the golden plates from the angel Moroni. The prophet often kept the plates hidden inside and around the frame home. Persecution forced him to leave Manchester in late 1827, and Joseph and Emma went to live with her family in Harmony, Pennsylvania. In 1828, a schoolteacher named Oliver Cowdery came to board here with the Smith family. Oliver learned of Joseph's work, and in the spring of 1829, he went to Harmony and became the prophet's new scribe. Elder George Albert Smith purchased the frame home and farm in 1907 and later conveyed ownership to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The home was renovated and restored to its original condition in 2000. The golden plates containing the Book of Mormon were buried in the Hill Cumorah, about 3 miles southeast of the Smith family farm. In the early hours of September 22, 1823, the angel Moroni showed Joseph Smith in vision exactly where the ancient record was hidden. Later that day, Joseph went to the place shown him by the angel. Joseph wrote, "On the west side of this hill, not far from the top, under a stone of considerable size, lay the plates, deposited in a stone box." He was not permitted to remove the plates on his first visit, but was instructed by the angel to return to this place every year until the time should come for obtaining the plates. Exactly 4 years later, the angel delivered the plates to the prophet Joseph for the purpose of translation and publication. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints acquired the Hill Cumorah in 1928. A granite monument topped by a 9-foot statue of Moroni was erected at the highest point of the hill in 1935. Today, the church operates a modern visitor center at the base of the hill. A dramatic pageant featuring events from the Book of Mormon is held here every summer. After translating the golden plates, Joseph Smith agreed with Mr. Egbert B. Grandin to print 5,000 copies of the Book of Mormon. Publication of the book was financed by Martin Harris, a family friend who mortgaged part of his farm to guarantee the $3,000 printing cost. In mid-August 1829, the printing of the book began. The Book of Mormon was first offered for sale in Grandin's bookstore in downtown Palmyra, New York on March 26, 1830, as another witness of the divinity and mission of Jesus Christ. It also provides tangible evidence of the prophetic calling of Joseph Smith. Oliver Cowdery later testified, "I wrote with my own pen, as Joseph translated the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God. I beheld with my eyes and handled with my hands the gold plates from which it was translated. I also saw with my eyes and handled with my hands the holy interpreters. The book is true. It contains principles of salvation, and if you, my hearers, will walk by its light and obey its precepts, you will be saved with an everlasting salvation in the kingdom of God on high." The church purchased the Grandin Building in 1978 and opened it as a historic site several years later. At the conclusion of extensive restoration in 1998, the building was dedicated as the Book of Mormon Historic Publication Site. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was organized in the Peter Whitmer home at Fayette, New York on April 6, 1830, at the Lord's command. Joseph Smith had to come to stay at the Whitmer home in June 1829 to escape persecution in Pennsylvania. Within a month of his arrival, the prophet completed the Book of Mormon translation, and the Lord revealed procedures for establishing his church. On April 6, about 60 friends and family members crowded into the 20 by 30-foot home to witness the organization of what was then called the Church of Christ. Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were sustained as the first and second elders in the church. On that occasion, they offered prayers, blessed and passed the sacrament, and received divine revelation. Following the service, several in attendance were baptized, including the prophet's parents. Joseph received many revelations while living at the Whitmer home, and the first 3 conferences of the church were held here. In 1831, the Whitmers moved to Ohio. The church purchased 100 acres of the Whitmer farm in 1926. The Whitmer home was rebuilt on its original site and dedicated in 1980 by President Spencer W. Kimball. Joseph and Emma Smith had moved to Harmony, Pennsylvania in December 1827 to escape persecution. In early April 1829, Oliver Cowdery came to meet the prophet and soon became his scribe. During translation of the plates that had been delivered to him by the angel Moroni, Joseph and Oliver went into the woods and prayed for guidance on the subject of baptism. In reply, the resurrected John the Baptist visited them on May 15, 1829, and ordained them to the Aaronic priesthood. He then commanded Joseph and Oliver to baptize each other in the nearby Susquehanna River. Oliver Cowdery wrote, "I was present with Joseph when an holy angel from God came down from heaven and conferred on us the lesser or Aaronic priesthood, and said to us at the same time that it should remain upon the earth while the earth stands. I was also present with Joseph when the higher or Melchizedek priesthood was conferred by the holy angel from on high. This priesthood we then conferred on each other by the will and commandment of God. Most of the Book of Mormon was translated at Harmony. Here the Lord also gave the prophet 15 revelations, later published in the Doctrine and Covenants. Joseph and Emma moved from Harmony in August 1830. The home they lived in burned down in 1919. From 1947 to 1959, the church acquired the land where Joseph and Emma lived and about 6 acres of riverfront property where the Aaronic priesthood was restored. In the fall of 1830, missionaries arrived in northeast Ohio where they experienced great success. The 100 people who were baptized within 3 weeks of their arrival more than doubled church membership. Among these converts were several who would play important roles in the church in years to come. These included Sidney Rigdon, Isaac Morley, Lyman White, and John Murdoch. Late in 1830, members of the newly organized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were directed to gather to Kirtland, Ohio. The prophet Joseph Smith and his wife Emma were among the first to travel to Kirtland, arriving in early February 1831. Isaac Morley invited many early converts to live on his 80-acre farm and build a small home for Joseph and Emma Smith shortly after the prophet's arrival in Ohio. Joseph and Emma lived in the home from March to September 1831. The Morley farm became a gathering place for church members who came to Kirtland, and many meetings were held in a nearby schoolhouse. While living on the Morley farm, Joseph received 13 revelations, now included in the Doctrine and Covenants. During this period, Emma gave birth to twins who soon died. Several days later, the Smiths adopted the infant twins of John Murdoch, whose wife Julia had died from complications of childbirth. The fourth conference of the church was held here in June 1831. During this conference, the first high priests of this dispensation were called, and a few saw in vision God the Father and His Son, Jesus Christ. Later that year, in a priesthood meeting held in an 18 by 20-foot log schoolhouse at the farm, Joseph prophesied to a small group of priesthood holders that this church will fill North and South America. It will fill the world. None of the original buildings remain on the Morley farm. Joseph Smith and his family moved to the home of John and Elsa Johnson in Hiram, Ohio, about 30 miles south of Kirtland in September 1831. The Johnsons were recent converts to the church and had become acquainted with the prophet in Kirtland. During the year Joseph Smith stayed here, the Johnson home served as headquarters of the church. Joseph received an outpouring of revelation within these walls, including a magnificent vision of the Father and the Son and the 3 degrees of glory. 17 sections of the Doctrine and Covenants were received here, and several conferences were also held here. In November 1831, the conference voted to publish a Book of Commandments containing revelations received by the prophet. The Lord confirmed His approval of this book, which eventually became the Doctrine and Covenants. In March 1832, Joseph was attacked by a mob in the middle of the night and was tarred and feathered near the home. The next day, despite his injuries, Joseph preached as he often did to a large congregation gathered in front of the home and baptized 3 persons. The church acquired the 160-acre Johnson farm in 1956 and restored the home to its original condition in 2001. Upon their arrival in Kirtland, the prophet and his wife Emma were graciously invited to live in the home of Newell and Elizabeth Whitney and their 5 children, where they stayed for a few weeks. While here, the prophet received important revelations, including the Lord's confirmation of his prophetic calling, the law of the church, and the office and duties of a bishop. Here, Newell K. Whitney was called as the second bishop in the church. A 3-day feast for the poor, many of them newly arrived saints, was hosted in Bishop Whitney's home in January 1836. Of this feast, Sister Whitney wrote, "The prophet Joseph and his 2 counselors were present each day, talking, blessing, and comforting the poor by words of encouragement and their most welcome presence." The church purchased the Whitney home in the early 1980s and restored it to its original condition in 2003. In the fall of 1832, Joseph Smith moved from Hiram, Ohio, back to Kirtland. Bishop Newell K. Whitney prepared an apartment for the prophet's family in his store, and Joseph lived here until the winter of the following year. The Whitney store served as headquarters for the church during that time. Many revelations now included in the Doctrine and Covenants were received by the prophet in this place, including the word of wisdom, the oath and covenant of the priesthood, and the command to build a temple in Kirtland. Joseph also completed much of his inspired translation of the Bible here. During the winter of 1832 through 33, the School of the Prophets was held in an upper room of the store. The school was organized to teach gospel doctrine and principles and to prepare members for ministry in the church. On one sacred occasion, members of the school beheld a vision of God the Father and the Son. The church purchased the Whitney store in the 1980s and restored it to its original condition in 1984. In December 1832, God commanded Joseph Smith to build a temple in Kirtland, Ohio. The prophet and several others saw the Kirtland Temple in a vision. Frederick G. Williams described the experience. "We, the First Presidency, went upon our knees, called on the Lord, and the building appeared within viewing distance. After we had taken a good look at the exterior, the building seemed to come right over us, and they were able to view the interior details." Construction began in June 1833. Many church members made enormous sacrifices to complete this house of the Lord. The prophet Joseph dedicated the Kirtland Temple on March 27, 1836, and repeated the ceremony several days later. Beginning in January and continuing past the dedication, many church members witnessed heavenly manifestations during this glorious season. Jesus Christ appeared to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery in the Kirtland Temple on April 3, 1836. They recorded, "We saw the Lord standing upon the breastwork of the pulpit before us. His eyes were as a flame of fire. The hair of his head was white like the pure snow. His countenance shone above the brightness of the sun, and his voice was as the sound of the rushing of great waters." Moses, Elias, and Elijah also appeared to Joseph and Oliver to restore priesthood keys for the salvation of all mankind. Most of the saints moved away from Kirtland in 1838. The temple fell into disrepair and its ownership was challenged. The reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, now known as the Community of Christ, gained title to the building in 1880. They restored and beautified the sacred place and maintain it today as a historic site with guided tours. Joseph Smith and 5 other church leaders were unjustly confined, first in the Richmond Jail and then in Liberty Jail from November 1838 to April 1839. The rough stone dungeon of Liberty Jail measured 14 by 14 feet, with a ceiling just over 6 feet high. The jail was a 2-story building constructed of 4 feet thick walls. The outer wall was made of limestone and the inner wall of solid oak. Loose rock and gravel was placed in between the 2 layers to discourage attempts at escape. While in Liberty Jail, the prophet wrote letters to his family and the saints. His correspondence contains some of the most poignant revelation found in Scripture. In this miserable jail, Joseph learned that his sufferings were still not comparable to those of the Savior, as the Spirit whispered to him, "The Son of Man hath descended below them all. Art thou greater than he?" He was taught that in the end, all these things shall give thee experience and shall be for thy good. Early in April 1839, Joseph and the other prisoners were allowed to escape and fled to safety in Illinois. The jail was eventually torn down, though some of the dungeon floor and walls remained. The property was purchased for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1939. President Joseph Fielding Smith dedicated a partial reconstruction of the jail housed within a visitor center in 1963. During the late winter and spring of 1839, more than 8,000 Latter-day Saints migrated from Missouri to western Illinois, with most settling in and around Quincy, Illinois. After his release from the Missouri jail, the prophet joined his family in Quincy and immediately began looking for a location where the saints could gather. Land was soon purchased about 30 miles north of Quincy, along the Mississippi River near the small town of Commerce. As the saints arrived, many became ill with malaria from a mosquito-infested swamp. On July 22, 1839, the prophet, starting with those in his own home and yard, went from house to house and from tent to tent upon the bank of the river, healing the sick by the power of Israel's God. Wilford Woodruff remembered this as the greatest day for the manifestation of the power of God through the gift of healing since the organization of the church. The prophet named the new Illinois city site Nauvoo, a Hebrew word meaning beautiful. Within 4 years, the saints had built one of the largest cities in Illinois. By the end of 1845, Nauvoo had about 11,000 residents. Joseph Smith moved his family to a log house on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River after escaping from Missouri in April 1839. The log cabin that came to be known as the homestead was one of the only buildings that predated the arrival of the saints to Nauvoo. While land was being cleared, surveyed, and platted, most arriving saints lived in wagons, tents, or dugouts. Joseph and Emma took many of them into their own meager quarters. The homestead served as church headquarters for about 2 years. Joseph enlarged the home in 1840. Here, Joseph recorded instructions on vicarious baptism for the dead, and the Lord revealed to him that the saints should build a temple in Nauvoo. Both church and civic meetings were held in the prophet's home. Consequently, it was often filled to capacity. Of that busy time, he wrote, "Business goes on with us in quite a lively manner, and our arduous but glorious undertaking." In August 1843, the prophet and his family moved across the street to the mansion house. Joseph and Emma hosted important visitors in the mansion house, and it was here that the saints viewed the bodies of Joseph and Hiram following the martyrdom. Joseph, Emma, Hiram, Joseph Sr. and Lucy Smith and others are buried in the family cemetery next to the homestead. The homestead and mansion house are owned by the Community of Christ, which provides guided tours of these historic sites. The Red Brick Store was constructed as an office for Joseph Smith and the First Presidency, and as a business to help the prophet support his family. A dry goods store was located on the ground floor, and Joseph's office and a meeting hall occupied the upper level. In this red brick store, the prophet Joseph Smith prepared his successors to carry on the great and mighty work of God. Originally built in 1841, the store became headquarters for the church shortly after its completion. Here, priesthood keys to govern the church were rolled onto the shoulders of the 12 apostles. The prophet spent many hours instructing these brethren during the last months of his life so that they could lead the church in his absence. In the upstairs room, Joseph organized the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo, not only to relieve the poor, but to save souls. Here the prophet administered to some church members sacred ordinances that would later be made available to all worthy saints in holy temples. And here, Joseph Smith recorded the revelation on the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, completed the translation of the Book of Abraham, and wrote the famous Wentworth letter containing the Articles of Faith. The building was demolished in 1890. The Community of Christ reconstructed the red brick store on its original site in the late 1970s and opened it to visitors in 1980. In Nauvoo, the Lord commanded that another temple be built unto my name, that I may reveal mine ordinances therein unto my people. For I designed to reveal unto my church things which have been kept hid from before the foundation of the world, things that pertain to the dispensation of the fullness of times. Construction of the Nauvoo Temple began in the spring of 1841 on a hilltop overlooking the Mississippi River. The saints eagerly labored to receive the blessings promised by the Lord. In the baptismal font, dedicated 9 months later, the saints performed proxy baptisms in behalf of the dead. The Nauvoo Temple was also the first in which the ordinance of eternal marriage was performed. This temple, which was such an integral part of the Lord's work, was not completed before Joseph Smith died a martyr. Work on the temple continued at great sacrifice after the death of Joseph Smith, and portions of the temple were dedicated as they were completed. At the time of its construction, the Nauvoo Temple was the biggest building east of St. Louis and west of Cincinnati, with an overall height of 158.5 feet. From December 1845 to February 1846, church leaders worked in the temple both night and day to administer its sacred ordinances to as many worthy saints as possible before the church was forced from Nauvoo. Nearly 6,000 faithful saints received their endowments before moving west. The temple was dedicated in the spring of 1846. After the saints left Illinois, the temple was destroyed by fire and a tornado. The church reacquired the temple lot in 1937 and rebuilt the Nauvoo Temple on its original site in 2002. The town of Carthage, located about